I'd like to ask you about a photograph that you've shown me, and in fact, I believe it's posted on your blog. It's a setting in Afghanistan. What would you want to tell us about that photograph?
One thing I think that's kind of interesting about the photo is the way they're dressed. They're not in uniforms, they're in civilian clothes. I don't recall what they had on their feet, but I can tell you that I saw many of these folks who wore rubber tire shoes. And I also saw many of these folks that would maybe have a military fatigue jacket on, and it would be cold and it would be snowing and blowing, and I don't know, somehow they still smiled. So there's something about the Afghan. They have this beard, they have these white teeth that are just absolutely startling, and they have black penetrating eyes. And when I looked at those people, when I looked at the fellow that was the rebel, that was the fighter, I said to myself, I can understand how they beat the Brits in the 1800s. I mean, they are resolute, they are determined, they're going to win. They're going to oust the Soviets, and they did. Very unusual people, very powerful fighters, very dedicated, very much Muslim, and very much believing in a God that's going to help them. So that picture is, yeah, it is kind of poignant when you think about it.
Do you remember the man who was in the picture? What became of him?
I don't remember the man or the men, but the picture was taken as a result of visiting a fellow by the name of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's a well-known figure, by the way, later became Prime Minister of Afghanistan. And he had a rebel group of about 10 or 15,000 soldiers, and I was assisting him, and my job was to help keep him armed and help keep him in a position where he could really contest the Soviets. And when he became Prime Minister, I guess he was a rather ruthless fella, and he got into trouble with all the tribal leaders. He was ultimately ousted, and he was banished to Iran, I believe, and 7 or 8 or 10 years later he came back to Afghanistan, and in some circles he's now known as the world's leading terrorist trainer. In my first or second, maybe it was, encounter with him, we went up the Khyber Pass in a beat-up old taxi cab. I didn't think we were going to make it. It was unbelievable, this car that was provided. I was with his secretary, a gentleman by the name of Adel Khan, Harvard graduate, spoke perfect English, and we got up to the area where Gulbuddin's camp was, and we were greeted by about 200 rebel soldiers. They were shooting their weapons in the air. I thought, oh man, what's this all about? And I got out of the cab, and man, they were all over me. And all they wanted was to shake a hand and see a smile, and so I did that. And I was led into the tent where I was going to meet with Gulbuddin. The tent was like a conference center. It had Persian rugs on the floor, it had murals on the walls. It was astonishing. They gave me a small little demitasse cup of coffee, about killed me, but it woke me up, and I stayed awake for 38 hours because of that one little cup. And about 15 minutes later, Gulbuddin arrived. And he came into this tent, and he looked like he'd just come off Savile Row in London, but he was dressed in his Afghan garb, but he was actually extremely beautiful. I mean, he really was. He had this beautiful beard, these eyes, these teeth, and he greeted me, and we sat down, and he said, "Tell me about the politics of Margaret Thatcher." So I sat back and I'm thinking, oh, first he said, "You live in London, don't you?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Tell me about the politics of Margaret Thatcher." And I sat back and momentarily thought, well, where is this going? I mean, this guy wants to see me because the Russians are down the road. Now we're talking about Margaret Thatcher. So we got to talking. And he said, what is she doing? And I said, well, right now she's closing down some of the mines, the coal mines in England, because they, in her view, they're not productive and they're just a drain on the economy. He said, well, tell me about Arthur Scargill. Now that one just about floored me. Here's a guy in the Khyber Pass fighting a war knowing somebody named Arthur Scargill. Arthur Scargill is the equivalent of John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers. He ran the mine union in England. But how would it Gulboot and Hekmatyr have that name? So anyway, I told him about the contest that was going on between the two of them, and the fact that Arthur Scargill had just been to see Gaddafi in, where in the heck is Gaddafi, the king? Or the
Libya.
Libya, yeah. He'd just been to Libya. And I thought that was a strange event. So we left England and we went to continental Europe. We talked about 20 minutes. We left continental Europe. We went down into the Middle East and Africa. Now, fortunately, living in London, I was getting the BBC every day and I was watching all this stuff. So I was able to sort of keep pace with this man, but he took me around the world, including Washington. And now, in retrospect, I thought, yeah, he was preparing himself to be prime minister. He wanted to know what's going on in this wide world of ours. Very interesting encounter, very unusual. But he was one of the men in that photo, I believe.